that lead people from fear to love, to encourage people to tell their own story as a way of nurturing and healing and for wholeness. Sarah Agnew, Dr. Sarah Agnew, is a storyteller, poet and minister at Wesley Uniting Church. She has published 3 volumes of poetry as well as liturgy, prayer and story in books, audio albums and other publications. Sarah was a keynote speaker for the 2020 International Gathering of the Network of Biblical Storytellers. She has brought along some books at the back, this side of the table, which you are welcome to purchase. And you can see her website, sarahagnew.com.au, and you'll see some brochures at the back. Sarah will talk to us for about an hour, then we'll break for 15 minutes for tea and coffee. Then resume with questions and discussions and finish by 10 p.m. Note that we're recording this session. So if you've been online, please remain muted while Sarah is speaking to avoid background noise. You can always make comments using the Zoom chat button. I'd like everyone to have Sarah here for her talk. Thank you very much. And also, just briefly, we have books here. If you're a member, you can borrow these books. At the back of the room, we have surplus books that we want to sell to you for minimal cost that will go back to our library. And we have Sarah's books that you can go, talk to Sarah about that. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you all. It's lovely to be here with you. I joined you last year when Kathy Lambert was here talking about mandalas and did a workshop the day after. So it's wonderful to be back with you. And I'm delighted to have any opportunity to talk about stories and storytelling. I want to begin with your thoughts. What do you think of when you hear me say storytelling?
Movies.
Movies? Yep.
Myths.
Myths.
Imagination.
Imagination.
Children's stories.
Children's stories.
Memory story.
Teaching stories and memory, was it? Yep.
Labels.
Labels.
Fables.
Oh, fables, sorry, yeah. Yep.
Observations.
Observations. Story is so rich, and we do have people, you hear singer-songwriters will get up and describe themselves as storytellers, dancers, movie makers, TV show makers. The label storyteller gets put on a lot of activities. For me, one of the major ways that I engage with storytelling is as an oral storyteller. Particularly, and I'll get to this, biblical storytelling, but I do also compose my own stories and tell stories that I've picked up along the way. At some level, we know inherently the importance of story, but sometimes I think humans forget how fundamentally we are story people. It's one of the things that sets us apart from, as far as we know, from many other animals. We tell stories. Now, I lived in the UK for 3 years, and when I was there, an MP called David Davies expressed his view of storytelling as sitting around reading John and Janet books, implying, I think, because I don't actually know what John and Janet books are, that it was an activity for children. Now, certainly it is, but I actually found this description of storytelling woefully ignorant as both a fundamental feature of human identity and communication and of the craft of oral storytelling, which is, for me, a distinct performance art. Now, the UK is full of storytelling centres, they run storytelling festivals, They happen all over the UK, promoting and nurturing the craft and practice of storytelling. It's the reason I went there, because of the Scottish Storytelling Centre in Edinburgh. Beyond that, when I came across this MP's perspective on storytelling, I had only just in recent days seen an advertisement for a professor of storytelling at the University of South Wales. They have a research centre that is devoted to storytelling. The George Ewart Evans Centre's storytelling researchers, teachers and practitioners are exploring the role of storytelling and story in healing as one example. They're collaborating with health practitioners, medical practitioners and researchers. And from that collaboration in the medical world, the centre defends the centrality of story in human interaction. They describe doctor and patient having a story each to tell. They talk about understanding doctor and patient being engaged together in working through the conflict or the challenge element of a story to help the hero or the heroine, the patient, to move towards their goal of health and well-being. So I was less than impressed with the ignorance of this MP, given the context of the countries in which he serves. To suggest, as he did, that storytelling is for primary school children rather than university students establishes a hierarchy in which younger children are somehow less than university students. Now that's an assertion I wholeheartedly reject, but that's a discussion for another day. The other thing he does is assume that storytelling is something that someone grows out of as you mature. I think, actually, we might find that story helps us to mature. Story helps the individual to know themselves, helps the community to understand, to observe, to shape our identity together as we evolve and grow. There's a social researcher in the US, Diana Butler Bass, who found in her research into church life that the sharing of stories, she was looking particularly at faith stories, which she called testimonies, was one of the identifiable features of communities, Christian communities, that were thriving. It's a practice that leads to health. Beyond the context of the church, in the broader communities, whatever way we engage in community, telling our personal and shared stories reminds us of who we are, reminds us what we value, it reminds us of where we've been, and it shows us what our hopes are for the future. What are our rituals of war and peace commemoration, if not telling stories of courage and loss, of hope for a better future? What are museums but installations that tell stories of migration, innovation, evolution, creation? What is the recounting of our day with our friends and family, but the telling of our stories? Seeking to find meaning within our experiences and through them to connect, and in being heard, to be affirmed and nurtured towards well-being. And there, I think, is where lies the most profound gift of storytelling. It's mutual encouragement of our well-being. We might think of the teller of a story as giving a gift with their story to those who hear, sharing our wisdom and experience through which to make meaning. Therefore, the hearer of a story receives a gift, the gift of story and encouragement through that story. Turn the tables, and you might think of the hearer as also giving a gift to the teller of a story with our listening, creating a welcoming space in which to hold the teller safe, to affirm them of immense value, the power of being heard. Our story, ourself being heard. It's an incredible gift that the teller receives. In that they're being nurtured in their very being. And I think there's something in particular that happens in a live sort of sharing of stories moment. We've talked about movies, books and TV shows. They're all wonderful portals for the imagination. But live, embodied presence with each other, our voices which connect to our emotions, the moment that we share together. For me, this is the connecting of humans with each other. The bringing of stories together to create another story. The story of this moment here, when we were together, laughing, crying, afraid, amazed, inspired. Frederick Buechner says, to have a life, you must have a story. In fact, many stories. Your life is not like a story. Your life is a story. And if any part of it is to have significance beyond you, that story must be told. He says, my story is not important because it is mine, as much as if I tell my story well, you will recognise that in many ways it is also yours. All humans have, and if you're Frederick Buechner, all humans are a story. And all humans have a responsibility to share our stories with others. Now, I'm going to say that again. We have a responsibility to share our stories. It's not just that we have a right or a need. For the sake of each other and our strength together as humans and as community, we have a responsibility to tell our story, to share the wisdom and experience and the meaning and our sense of individual and shared identity through the telling of those stories. Along the way, I've found that sometimes we need help to find the stories within us that need telling, that need to be heard. And sometimes we need help to shape those stories. There's the incidental everyday telling of stories I mentioned with family and friends. But there's also the crafting of a story so that you highlight certain things. You highlight the wisdom or the insight that you've gathered along the way. That's been a big part of the work I've done over the years, is to help people shape their stories so that they will be well heard. Sometimes
that's her. Okay, we're in, I think.
To tell our story when our courage is lacking. So we might go to workshops. You might have heard of story events like the Moth, which originated in the USA, 10 times 9, which originated in Belfast, and there's a regular event in Melbourne and a regular event in Adelaide in that tradition. I remember being in various churches where we had faith sharing nights. You know, you shared soup and rolls and someone told their faith story, and then we all were inspired to share our stories together. All of these things, and I'm sure there's many other movements and events that are organised that give space. Andrew, isn't it? Yeah, we were talking about poetry slams. There's another way of kind of sharing stories. There's all sorts of ways that we gather because we have this inherent need to tell and hear each other's stories. And stories have, I hope I'm making the point, stories have a purpose. And just as each human being has potential that's waiting to be realised and fulfilled, there's potential in a story. It's waiting to be fulfilled. It's the potential to connect us to each other, perhaps connect us to the sacred, or to the deepest part of ourselves. Stories do things. I would even argue stories live. Stories heal. Stories invite discovery. They show, they tell, they teach, and stories strengthen. They strengthen the bonds between us as humans in community. This giving and receiving of stories isn't without cost, I don't think, because it makes us really vulnerable, both to tell our own story and also to hear someone else's. It might move us. It might provoke us to change our perspective. It might make us think something new. It might make us feel. In making ourselves vulnerable to the work of stories, we make ourselves vulnerable to the teller of a story as we hear, and we make ourselves vulnerable to the listener of our story as we tell it. In that vulnerability, in that opening up to each other, we connect. With our whole selves, we give each other of our wholeness and our fullness. And in doing that, we are at once, not alone. And if a story does nothing else, if all it does is connect you to someone else, I think it's done enough. Nurturing that relationship and that connection is part of our healing and moving towards wholeness as human beings, because we are not fully human except with each other. And as an aside on vulnerability, if you want to explore the importance of vulnerability for our wholeheartedness and our health as individuals and communities, Brené Brown's writing is a great place to start. I'm in the middle of reading her book, Dare to Lead, at the moment, and it is both an encouragement and a profound challenge on the question of vulnerability and courage. I'll leave that with you. Stories weave us together then, so that we become one. Strengthened in the sharing of stories, more fully whole, more healthy, more fulfilled as human beings. And that is why I tell stories. I tell biblical stories and I tell human stories. I believe in the power of story to nurture the healing and wholeness of human beings. And for me, importantly, it's what Jesus did. And his story is the story that shapes my story. So I now want to move into telling you some of the ways that storytelling plays in my life and work. And I'm going to begin with those biblical stories, the sacred story of the Christian tradition, the story of God and God's people, and the practice of biblical storytelling. So what is biblical storytelling? If you've got half a dozen biblical storytellers up here, you'd probably get half a dozen answers about what biblical storytelling is. For me, I'm part of the network of biblical storytellers, and the method that most of us would use is to take a portion of the Bible, and some people will do like 10 verses, and some people do whole books. And we internalize it in a version that's, one of the accepted versions that's around, translation that's around, or some people translate their own, translate it themselves. We internalize it, and then we stand before an audience and we tell it by heart. Other types of biblical storytelling include, another thing I do is to imagine into the gaps of the Bible, the stories that are not told, and tell those stories, either in writing or, again, oral storytelling. There's another movement called godly play, which uses props and is focused on inviting, particularly children, but it works for children of all ages, to wonder and to ask questions of the story and therefore find ourselves in the story. But the particular type of biblical storytelling that I mostly practice was actually really integral in my story of becoming a minister. So I'd been out of the church for a while, and then I came back into the church to do some creative things. And one of those things was to run a jazz cafe church. Now, I know I was in the 90s, 2000s, it was the 2000s. Wasn't particularly new. Pretty sure in the 70s there were plenty of jazz cafe type churches. But it was new to us. And the basic structure was we would hear a story, whether it was projecting the video of a Richard Dawkins conversation to provoke conversation, or most often me reading aloud dramatically or telling a biblical story. So I kind of just fell into this way of telling stories. And then as the jazz would play, we would talk deeply and sometimes do creative stuff to respond to the story. Partway through the life of that jazz cafe church, I started a year of discernment, because all of my ideas about what I was going to do with my life had so far come to, well, not much. And I thought it might be time to listen to God. It was an idea. And I was not prepared for where that was going to take me, I have to tell you. One of the things that you do in this year of discernment is you work with a mentor and you take some courses at the theological college. My mentor listened to me talk with some frustration about, I'm a musician and I'm quite empathetic and I'm quite a performer and I like languages and I'm a bit of a scholar and they're pulling me in all different directions. What am I doing? And he said, do you know what I hear? I hear something like the stories of the ancient Celtic bards and druids who wandered around between communities and told the people's stories. He had no idea where that seed was going to take me. One of the courses I did was a preaching course. The end of semester assignment was all of the students got up in front of the class and preached a sermon. I essentially got up and told a story, and in doing so had this moment partway through the actual preaching of the story thing. Oh dear, I'm a preacher. Wasn't expecting that, but I was a preacher as a storyteller. One of the last things I did before I actually put in my application to become a minister was attend the Network of Biblical Storytellers National Gathering. Now again, remember I said about the Blackwood Jazz or the jazz stuff? I was just naturally, intuitively telling stories. And then I sat in a conference centre in Sydney and saw all these other people telling the biblical stories. And it suddenly dawned on me, I was a storyteller. And the conversations I had with my fellow storytellers led me to understand that I could indeed, and it might help the church if I did, become a minister through being a storyteller. So storytelling is integral to me being a minister. And as I studied, I did just about every biblical studies course I could do and found my way to studying biblical storytelling as a scholarly pursuit at honours level, and then it took me to Edinburgh to do a PhD essentially in storytelling. The PhD was basically a study of my practice as a biblical storyteller. I'd noticed that in that internalising of stories, when I moved intuitively with gesture, when I felt the emotion, when I looked into the eyes of my audience and understood what this story might mean for you in your story, I was understanding the story. I was understanding meaning in a way that biblical scholarship ignored almost entirely, except if they might have put a little note for their bias of being a white middle class, educated, Uniting Church female minister. I spent 3 years developing a new method for interpreting the Bible that takes seriously the way that humans engage in interpretation and meaning making through our whole embodied selves. The book that came out of all of that was just released this week, which is, phew, done. And I hope will encourage and invite people to engage with these foundational stories for the Christian community in holistic ways, bring our whole selves to them, because essentially that's what our faith is about. Over the past decade or so, I've also been composing and performing my own stories. For a while there, I was a bit of a magpie, and without even setting out to do it, I was collecting a whole lot of stories, stories of people who were butting up against each other on faith lines. So there was the story of Raoul Wallenberg, who in World War II was a Swedish diplomat sent to Hungary. To that point, a reasonably apathetic human being, but he gathered people around him, not being a Jew himself, but deeply moved by the injustice of these people being oppressed by the Nazi regime. He gathered a whole group of people around him, and they saved together 65,000 Jews in Budapest before he disappeared and was never heard from again. I told the story of Elizabeth Munster, who was an Anabaptist in Holland, was on the wrong side of things, and the Christians who were in power oppressed them and executed them. She wrote a letter to her daughter in prison after her husband had already been executed, essentially just simply for being an Anabaptist. And she wrote a letter to her daughter that deeply expresses her commitment to their understanding of who God is and how they are to live. Once her daughter was born and weaned, she too was executed. I have a range of stories in this series that I called Inhumanity. Someone once said to me, it's only humans who can behave inhumanely. Other animals don't do it. So they're the stories of profound inhumanity and equally profound and beautiful humanity. I have a series of stories and poems in response to Shakespeare, who is my favourite storyteller, called In His House, and I recorded those as an audio album. And some of the stories from In His House cross over with Inhumanity. So I told the story of, and I won't tell it tonight because it's at least 15 minutes long, depending on how much I embellish it, but it's the story of two Elizabethan poets, Kit and Will. Can anyone guess who Kit and Will might be? Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare. I imagine into the gaps of William Shakespeare's life and imagine he and Kit going off to France to spy on Catholic defectors for the crown. And I finish it with a line from The Merchant of Venice. If you prick us, do we not bleed? I think I was more profoundly moved by the stories I discovered and collected for this series that were within Christianity, those stories in the Reformation, Christians against Christians, just what were we doing? I mean, the Christian against Jewish stories are pretty awful as well. But that sense of Catholics and Protestants just at each other. And I could still hear it in my dad's voice in the 90s as we drove past. There's the Pats, they're done. Growing up in country Australia, Catholics were other, we were Protestant. So it's a long legacy, and I wanted to tell those stories because they're my tradition, and I can see it playing out in all sorts of other faith and intercultural antagonism in our time. Another story that I told is quite a poetic one, and I'm going to give you an actual story now rather than just anecdotes. And this is another Shakespearean one that is both Inhumanity and the Shakespeare collection. Again, it's Merchant of Venice. Mercy Qualified, in which I take the stand against Portia of Belmont. So it's just a scene from a story. The quality of mercy is not strained through colander to drain away the life from heaven falling, as if in part it can be taken as one chooseth and prefers. Nor a crown is mercy, that too heavy, weighing with expectation more than we are able to deliver, can lightened be by selected removal of ornament, thus dimming glory in the turning round to suit the wearer. The quality of humanity is not measured one against another, as if without our eyes one cannot see, without our skin one will not bleed if pricked or cut. The quantity of worth of human dignity varies not from the one unto another according to their faith or occupation. You have the self-same need as I for food, to sleep, to dream, to love, to simply be. We are all met by seasons that befall a human because one is a human. So then, human, given mercy with which to temper justice, which gift comes verily from within the sacred heart, why to the Jew before you who seeks justice, which path leads none of us to freedom, so you say, do you proclaim the virtue of God's mercy, a prayer we offer, hope we yearn for all who human are? Why thus pronounce, if then your deeds no mercy render, nor even justice without mitigation, to this Jew who on your mercy by Christian power has fallen? By you is Christian charity forsaken, for that power more alluring than the jewels of mercy by your speeches so prettily admired. What think you will show of Christian kindness, love, and mercy when fortune is restored, but the faith of the vanquished must be denied? Take you so easily the knife of vengeance, cut you now so readily when flow of blood you sought so recently to stop? No human, but power is the enemy before you. Nay, it is even found to be within. No faith or foreigner or even businessman whose work you find distasteful is your enemy. Learned scholar, pretending so to be. Mercy do you call upon, yet mercy have you executed not. Yourself its executioner instead become. We all may do well to watch the rain that falleth, blessing they that welcome it as well as they that see it not. Remember we, that we can never catch the rain in strainers, holy as they are, but must, in vessels surer, take the gift for all it does possess, and pour it generously in blessing all, who worthy of blessing are. So I will let you go in freedom, pretended learned scholar, and send you back into Bassanio's arms impassioned. And will you spare a thought for Shylock, the vanquished villain so he seemed, that your victim hath become? Or will you leave that up to me? What sentence to pronounce at close of this your trial? Why, one of yours, of course. And may we do better in the living of its truth. The quality of mercy is not strained. It falleth like the rain in blessing, pouring blessing, loving kindness as we drink it. And even more, as we ourselves flow full of mercy, fully human. Many of my stories are quite poetic, even the prose ones are quite poetic, or they take the form of a poem or maybe a spoken word piece. Blue Koala is another story I wrote. A lot of these stories I wrote while I was also working on the PhD. It was quite a rich time, actually. It's a story in verse, which if you look at it in the printed version, I asked a friend to illustrate it for the print version. It looks a bit like a children's storybook, but don't be fooled. It's actually for older children and adults, telling the story of a koala who finds herself in a dark hole and has friends who come and find her and sit beside her until she can find the light for herself. I recorded that as well as an audio story along with the Shakespeare ones. Then there's poetry itself, which in individual poems and in whole collections tell parts of my own story much more slantwise. So what you'll see over there is On Wisdom's Wings, which is my first collection, and that tells stories of my experiences of depression and then moves into the journey of discovery of my vocation and identity as a storyteller and poet and minister. The Only Constants collectively tells the story of leaving Australia and landing in Scotland. And Hold Them Close, which was launched here in Canberra, tells the story of the PhD years. Another kind of collection I have over there is Pray the Story. Again, while I was in Scotland, I went over there without much funding. So I had to look for ways to support myself while I stayed, and I went onto a crowdfunding site and had patrons for a while. And that brought a new level of creativity and professionalism as an artist. Pray the Story was created for really the patrons to give them something a bit more polished and a bit more intentional. Really sort of, if I thought about myself as a storyteller, poet and minister, what's the unique thing about that? Well, I can write poetic prayers for worship and devotion that respond to the biblical stories. So they respond to the stories that are set on the weekly lectionary. And the book that's over there represents the first 3 years of those weekly prayer poems. Storytelling for me is also fulfilled by being a story hearer. When I was going through the training for being a minister, we had to do a lot of learning and training in pastoral care. The more we did, the more I found I uncovered a deep lack of confidence in pastoral care. I don't know where it came from really, but I wasn't really sure I could offer people pastoral care. Even now, I do it differently to the traditional minister. I did a course in narrative therapy, and I found in the language of curiosity and wonder, the practice of honouring someone's story, the language that helped me to become someone who was confident in offering pastoral care. I mentioned in passing that I've facilitated some workshop spaces for people. There's a Scottish mental health arts and film festival that's run every year, and I ran a series of workshops for people to find their story. And the profound gift it was for some of these people who were part of a cohort of a drop-in centre for people with mental health challenges, to identify the theme was passion. What were they passionate about? And for them to identify part of their story that was positive and life-giving through passion, and to then see them actually stand up, some of them, and tell the story to a live audience. In some ways, I'd almost rather hear other people tell their stories when it's like that than tell stories myself. It just reinforced what I was telling you about the importance of story, that it makes us vulnerable and it connects us and it heals us. Humans are inherently, fundamentally, and naturally storytellers. We experience healing and nurture when we tell our story and are heard. We experience encouragement when we hear another's story. And in the mutual vulnerability of telling and hearing each other's stories, we form strong, vital, healthy communities that lead us all further towards well-being. I'm going to finish with another story, but I'm going to give you the option of choosing. Do you want to hear Blue Koala, the story of the koala and her friends? Or I have a story that is about this storyteller going to Scotland. I mean, I can probably tell them both, but which one would you like?
We want both.
Scotland, all right, we'll do Scotland. And well, Blue Koala is actually my story, but if I've got time, I'll come back and tell that later. So this is another very poetic story. It's called A Story for the Living. In a small and still young village, tucked in behind the hills, far from cities large and busy, a storyteller has emerged from among her people. Poet, teacher, friend. She serves the village faithfully, with tales of times long past and stories new. Poems too, for moments here and now. For some time now, the storyteller has dreamed. Visions have appeared to her. She sees that there are stories, poets, and tellers in foreign lands, in far-flung places across deep water. We have riches to share with you, wisdom from your ancestors. Come, receive our gifts for you and for your people. Oh, our storyteller yearns to go to them and to discover and to wander the small and distant island from which they came, her people and their stories, so many generations past. But can she go? Is it not further than dreaming can take her? To the spirit she calls, the story spirit who has guided her thus far, and in return she hears. My daughter, you are troubled, I can see. What so disturbs your soul? I have a vision calling persistently, but it seems impossible to follow. The call is but a whisper. Can I fly so far from safety and face the unfamiliar quite alone? Well, do not go. If impossible it really is. You have your books and screens, and on top of that you have one of the most potent imaginations I ever created, I flatter myself. There is much you can still learn from where you are. But think of this. Your eyes I made for seeing, nose for smelling, skin for touching. I made your ears to hear and your tongue to taste. Is it possible, do you think, for you to endure the loss of tastes and sounds, textures, smells and sights more easily than the hardships you will face if you go? Hardships there were, and plenty, but our storyteller could not stay indeed, as her spirit guide had noted. The dream insisted, revealing itself to be not just a dream, but a story for the living. Oh, she often yearned for her dear village and her people, with an aching almost tearing her beyond endurance. But her spirit guide went with her. The stories that had called did share their wisdom and their life. And here she stays, on this tiny island home of her ancestors, embraced and chest overflowing with more treasure than she ever did dream. Thank you. So I'll leave the other story and I'll come back to that and maybe some poems when we have conversations, see where that goes.
Yep, that sounds good. Thank you very much,
My
Sarah.
pleasure.
So you're all like to break now for 15 minutes and we will come back about 10 past, quarter past 9, sometime like that, and have a cup of tea or talk to people. Nico? Thank you. That's really good. It's very true, isn't it? Life is a story. Oh yeah, I was talking about the follower.
Yeah, the milestones are good moments.
Yeah, right. I'd all like to come and sit back and cool down after our lovely gathering. And Sarah's going to talk more about her experiences, and we can ask her questions about how she came to be a storyteller, etc. and etc. Thank you. Yeah. So I really want to open it up to your questions, and it was noted that I did not once mention Jung. Sorry, or you're welcome. But I'm really interested if those of you who are really interested in Jung's thinking and practice, if you found connections or resonances or contradictions in the sort of thing I was talking about with stories, I'd be really interested to hear that. And I'm happy to take whatever questions you have of me, or I can just keep telling you stories. I know we've got a couple of questions from the people on Zoom, so that's good.
I have a question about Carl Jung and the psychology of storytelling. One of the things that came through in your description of the healing power of stories was the therapeutic function, and one of the key themes for Carl Jung, of course, is the archetypes of the collective unconscious, and one of the things about the archetypes is that they bubble up into consciousness as a way of, as a response to repression. And so I'm just wondering about your thoughts, Sarah, about how stories bring into consciousness things that in ordinary life we prefer to keep hidden, and how that revelation of the concealed is a really important part of the meaning of stories.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think there's something about story in particular that connects with our emotions, so that I was talking about, I think it was the Buckner's thing of, I tell my story not so much for it being my story, but for the possibility of connection and reminding you of yours. And I think part of the way that we do that and are reminded of our own story is the emotion. When I studied poetry and creative writing at university, they told us again and again about not being afraid of being specific, particularly in poetry. So tell specifically my story, the location, tell the story of I went from Adelaide to Scotland. The emotions of leaving, of home, of homesickness, of dislocation will connect with someone else and their story in its particularity. But we meet in the emotion and it'll evoke something. So I think there's something about the emotion that story connects with and our wholeness. There's also something open about stories. When I studied narrative therapy for a bit, the curiosity and the wonder and the openness and that constant possibility of the story opening up to other stories and to depth. So there's something about that as well that is in the nature of story, to open. So I think that's part of why it does that, why it catches us off guard, why it pulls stories out of us that we've forgotten, repressed, lost in some ways. And there's a power in that, power that can at times I think overpower us. So stories can certainly be a bit dangerous or threatening or unsettling, and it's worth taking care, I think, when we tell stories. Or I wrote recently on my blog, I will stop rambling after this. I wrote recently on my blog about, in an article about, it was Suicide Awareness Month last month. And I was remembering when I had gone to see, can't even remember the name of the movie, it was Lady Gaga's big movie a couple of years ago. I was fairly new here in Canberra, and I went to see it with new friends who I didn't know, and they didn't know my story, which includes a year of being quite profoundly suicidal. And I didn't know that there was suicide in the story, and it undid me, and it had the power to undo me. And I think that comes to mind when I hear you say, about that power of story to pull out of us the stories we don't want told, or they're too frightening or big or whatever to give time to a lot of the time. And the thing that I had come to, like the place I had come to with my own story, with that story, I understood it enough that when it surprised me, I could give it the space it needed and give myself the space I needed. So it's important when we are surprised for the first time with a story we've long forgotten, to actually understand it and be prepared for the next time it's going to surprise us, I think.
Yeah.
When you say that, I think really very true. The fact that the story and the listener and the teller of the story are in an interaction. In 1984, I went to India with my colleague Agnew to do research on a linguistic problem in the dialect of Hindi. And we found that no one wanted to speak that dialect because they considered it the dialect of uneducated people. People might use it in their families, but they wouldn't use it with an outsider. So nobody would would talk to us. They always want to talk standard Hindi. And so we decided, well, if we want to do this, we have to get people to talk. And they have to speak in their dialect. And they're not going to do that. What can we do? And we decided we'd ask them to tell stories. And that was very successful. Yeah. And in fact, it was so successful that we abandoned the linguistic research and became a research on collecting stories. But just to give an example, that was quiet. To carry on what you were saying, I remember there was one case. We were in a village called Koala, and it was 40 kilometers from that. A very isolated village. And we said, would anyone like to tell a story? And there was actually a storyteller there. And he was very well known among the village people. They said, so-and-so. Archibald, he can tell you a story. And we said, good. So we went, would you tell us a story? And he said, no, because it's still light. Because to tell a story, it's going to be dark. And I was interested later on to find out that Irish storytellers also evidently always told their stories at night. Because it should be dark when, the darkness closes in and brings the people together. And finally we persuaded him because we had to get away before it was very late in the afternoon because we were riding a motorcycle and the roads are so bad that we don't want to be out in the dark. So we finally managed to persuade him to please tell us a story, even though it wasn't dark, and he did. And the fascinating thing was that he was truly gifted. He could gather people. They didn't have to come and sit and listen. It was just him and us. And we were recording, of course, so that's a bit off-putting too. But, people would come and they'd sit down, and there were all kinds of people. There were old men, there were women of all ages, there were children, very, noisy and moving around. There were also young men who were very rowdy. But all these people, in the story he told, and eventually we published that story, in the story he told, he had all of those people held, and they would respond to him. So he told the story, and they'd say, huh? Just in that kind of, not a real word, but a kind of, and it created that bond. But the fascinating thing was, and kind of what you were saying, the fascinating thing was that he was able, like a 50s film, the 50s, or maybe, 50s, 40s, 50s, when films were heavily censored, you had to make allusions to different topics. He did that. So that those children could listen and they heard a story that was for children. Yeah. The young men, they're interested in sex, They heard a story, there were all kinds of sexual allusions that he made, which other people, the children couldn't understand, but the adults did. It was fascinating. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah.
You see that in a lot of like animated kids films. There's layers on there, allusions.
Toy Story.
Yeah. And I think that's such a wonderful thing about story, that it meets us where we are very often. Yeah. Thank you. That's wonderful.
It's just a little incident I can remember once. I was doing a tour of the Catherine Gorge, and we had a young Aboriginal man who was the guide for the tour, and quite an ancient structure, that the gorge, very, very deep. And this young man, he was a graduate in biology, but he told the story of how the gorge was formed. And it was about how the rainbow serpent came and it had to travel down a certain distance, and it got to a place and it stayed for a while. And that's why the gorge was very deep there, and then it moved on. Then he told the story again about, from a geological point of view, how the Earth was actually formed. To him, both stories were real. So this is the reality of the story. The story is real.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's something about there's lots of things, but something about the story world that's created, particularly when you've got a live storyteller and they take you there, they transport you. And then there's a storyteller I encountered once, Megan McKenna, who before she tells a story, she always says this: some stories are true. Some stories actually, how does it go? All stories are true. Some stories actually happened, and now this one's going to happen to you. And there's something about the truth that we find in storytelling that isn't truth with a capital T. It's, again, it's the story meets us where we are and invites us, it opens up, invites us to find truth, and it does allow for multiple truths, multiple stories to sit alongside one another and actually speak to one another, so that the scientific and the dreaming stories can sit side by side and there's a conversation between them, and both are true, and both happen to those who hear them, which is, I think, one of the gifts of story.
Now we've got about 8 people joining us on the Zoom, which is great. We're recording your talk, so it'll be up on the Jung Society website.
Sure.
And Frances has a question. She says, I'll read it out for her. Some friends last night thought that history was no longer valued and was passing away. We had to look forwards, not backwards. Do you think storytelling about the past is still important?
Yes. I'll say some more. And there are nuances to that. How we tell the stories of the past are important. Who tells the stories of the past is important. What our purpose is in telling the story of the past is important. If we're telling the story of the past to kind of hanker after the past and stay there, or try and return to those idyllic times when I was younger, it was all perfect, that's not going to be a helpful way of telling the stories of our past. But I think it's important to tell the stories of where we've come from. Anyone who's been involved in genealogy or those ancestry.com type things, the stories of those who went before us tell us something about who we are now and who we might become. So yes, it's important. We were talking about the stories over supper, the stories of Australia and Indigenous stories. And I've been really interested to hear Indigenous leaders in the last sort of 12 months or so that I've been listening say something to the rest of Australia, that the stories of Indigenous Australia are our stories. And until we claim them and honour them as our collective stories, we're going to have trouble moving forward. So there's something about understanding where we've come from and understanding where this land and its people have come from. That will help us move forward. So yes, telling the stories of the past is absolutely vital. And yes, I think it needs care and sensitivity. Who tells it, how we tell it, and why we tell it.
And Kirsten adds to that history is always valued and we will always have our stories. Rabbi Harold Kushner once said, God made people because he loves stories. I think he was right.
Love it. Yeah. Yep. Definitely.
And when I mentioned history, it's his story. I've never seen the word her story.
Yeah.
And more books coming about the majority of the planet who need a voice in that.
Yeah.
And need to tell their stories, and it's coming.
It is, isn't it?
We are in an age where that's happening more
Yeah.
and more.
Yep.
But it's always good to remember that it's only one version of history, and it's the victor's version.
It so often is. Yep.
And we see it on the television because the victor's film keep being played over and over again.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And there's something quite powerful and profound about those, that sort of hero story. And what I see changing, I don't know whether you would agree, but I think we're broadening who we allow, like who gets to play the hero. So we're actually seeing more stories of women who are the main protagonists, and they're the hero of the story. And so I just watched the Enola Holmes, which tells the story of Sherlock Holmes's sister. And she's absolutely the protagonist of the story. Sherlock Holmes is in, I don't know, possibly not even a third of the scenes, and it pushes back at some of the patriarchal stuff that's inherent in the stories. And she saves the boy, and some of the retellings of Snow White type stories in the last decade have Snow White as the saviour, not the saved. So yeah, I think there is as I say, there's a tide turning in terms of who is the victor or the hero, and whose stories get told. We're opening it up a bit slowly. It'd be nice to have a bit quicker, but yeah, and it's time. It's well time.
If I can add to that, another way of telling stories is I'm writing my memoir for a particular reason. And in writing that, I'm telling my story, and it's changing all the time because as I'm writing it and thinking about it, I perceive different things in it.
Yes.
I analyze different things in it.
Yeah.
So it's a self-developmental course, which I didn't know.
Yeah.
I started it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it goes on and on. It's I'll have to call it quits sometime or other.
Yeah.
And then if I have any additional thoughts about it, it's an addendum.
Yeah, yeah. It's the thing about stories, if they're alive, they're never finished. You do have to just say, well, I'm finishing it here.
Yeah.
It's like a PhD thesis. This is where I'm saying it's done. It's never going to be done, but I'm saying it's done, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. It's history.
Yeah.
But it's my story.
Yes, yeah.
And it's evolving. It's
yeah,
evolving.
Yeah.
And in it too, I said that anyone that has siblings, all these siblings have different parents because they have different stories.
Yeah.
And every sibling sees parents in a different way, so they can't understand each other.
Yeah.
Either.
Yeah.
You come with a particular point of view, and siblings will say that was not true.
Yeah. Yeah.
And parents don't know the children's stories. And it's quite an awakening when you hear children's stories, children's versions.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah. I absolutely resonate with that siblings thing. I'm sure my sisters and I all have completely different stories about our parents and perspectives on who they are.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes. And you can't blame people for getting different perceptions.
No.
Nobody's wrong.
No, exactly. And I wonder if, if I go back to the stories I was collecting for a while there of where we were butting up, different faiths are butting up against each other. I've long wondered what difference it would make if we heard each other's stories with wonder rather than with a sense of, well, that's not how I see it, so you must be wrong. But as we were talking about with the science and the dreaming stories, how can we see the two stories sit, or multiple stories sit alongside each other and celebrate the richness that the breadth of that shows us, like a kaleidoscope or something that's ever changing. Yeah.
It's a dream.
Oh yeah.
But
Yeah.
we're so tribal.
Yeah, we are. Yep.
And so often people don't have the opportunity to tell their stories.
Yes.
And that's something that's quite traumatic.
Oh yeah, I think so, definitely. Yep. Yep. There's at a storytelling conference I went to a long time ago, I heard of the work of a storyteller who uses story in peace building. And one of the stories that sits, it's not necessarily, it's sort of tangent to that, where you've got two groups in conflict, say, a couple of gangs in the streets of one of the big cities in the US, and then you're trying to get them to talk to each other and hear each other, and you're not getting anywhere. He will get them to stop and ask them for stories, and eventually doesn't really take very long, they'll find a story, they'll name a story that each group knows, and they'll tell the story and they find common ground. And there's a trauma that happens when we ignore that too, I think, our collective and our shared stories, and we can start to heal from some of that when, the oppressed, when their stories are told, when opposing groups hear each other and find common ground in a story. It's incredibly powerful. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a good strategy, yeah.
Mm.
And that's where the story of Jesus Christ is such a powerful one, because about somebody who's the most important person in the world, but who is crucified and treated as nothing. It's a very powerful story.
It is, yeah, yeah. And there's the power of hearing a story that comes from a shared tradition, or like fairy tales or folk tales or biblical stories or whatever, that help us to find ourselves or find inspiration, courage, solidarity with a character in it. Again, it helps us understand and find healing and move forward. Yeah, really hopeful. Mm.
Yeah, it's interesting that, like the story of Jesus, that it's not just one story either.
Yeah.
And for example, the book of Judas, we're told that Judas was unwilling to be the betrayer.
Mm.
There's a variety of stories.
Yeah.
And one should never, I think, close oneself on.
Yeah. Yep. And there's absolutely a reason that the stories of Jesus were like what we have in the canon is the stories, rather than the sayings collections or whatever, because they open us up and they do something in particular. Yeah. Yep.
I think some stories are just too painful,
Mm.
to kind of spend the time.
Yep.
There's too much trauma.
Oh yeah, definitely. So with the network of biblical storytellers that I'm part of, there's a scholars seminar attached to that, which some of the professional storytellers and people working in the field that I was working in, biblical performance criticism, get together and do some work. Last year, I wasn't with them, but they were telling the book of Hosea, which Hosea is a prophet who, the story goes, he is commanded by God to marry a prostitute, and there is an awful lot of violence, abuse, really violent language, using a metaphor of prostitute for Israel, the nation. And my colleagues were just talking about it again recently in a Zoom chat, and they're still traumatised by telling it, and have come to the conclusion that that's not a story we can tell. Because whatever it was doing at the time, it's now no longer doing. It's now actually going to cause trauma. It's too hard to hear. And that's a huge challenge when it's a story that's in a canon. And it's something to be really sensitive about when it's our own personal story. To tell it, let it be, and then let it go. to not rehash the stories that are just going to cause us trauma and further pain in the retelling. I think it's really important to recognise that and honour it, definitely. Thank you for reminding us of that. Yeah.
I was privileged some years ago to do a rather series of religious education in Redhill Primary School. It was just half an hour a day for a week. I think 5 sessions for grade 4, what's that, 9-year-olds. And I think it was some trepidation because my life at that time was teaching IT to, well, let's not talk about IT people, but anyway, adults. And a classroom situation with about 24 or so kids in it. And we had some minimal materials, pictures and so forth. And we're doing the book of Genesis, you know, with the Indians, and 7 days and Western and so forth. And I did a little bit of an introduction. One of the kids sort of said, my mother says that you're going to brainwash us as well. And I had a chuckle. I said, yeah, well, that's an interesting idea. You know, I'll tell you what, on Friday, towards the end, we'll have a think back as to what the week's been like. And you can let me know if you've been brainwashed by these strange stories and things in the book of Genesis. And we talked about the darkness, you know, and then there was the firmament and the soil and the animals, the plants and then the animals. Same sequence, of course, of what paleontologists talk about today. But the question of the 7 days was a bit dodgy. And I said to them, you know, this is a story devised by people at the time. When do you think that this is the word of God, our Creator, or is it people trying to explain the inexplicable, etc.? You know, when do you think this was 4,000 years ago, or 4,000 million years ago, whatever? That's okay. All these things are okay. Let's just think of it as a story. And anyway, I was wondering whether 9-year-olds could grasp this question of scientific reality and just telling stories, or is it just imagination and so forth. But they loved it.
Great.
They engaged with this idea that you don't have to argue about it, you know, we're just a marvelous story. Yep. And we had a little discussion on Friday about brainwashing and so forth. They loved that, you know. And I was just so impressed that this could make sense of these different levels for 9-year-old kids. And there was no, I was uncertain what I do if they became the principal had to come and see what the uproar was coming from my or whatever, but no, there was none of that. It's an marvelous experience.
Great, thank you.
And I'm just quite regretful that it's not part of our mainstream education. I mean, some people do. Jean's got these big books that do good schools and that love, you know. But it's not really part of the mainstream of our education from Christian storytelling.
But you must have been quite skillful in doing that.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't particularly say that, but I think if you'll comment, I think, you know, told. I said we did what I could. I don't think it takes any special skills. I think we all have some capacity to do that, but we don't really exercise it particularly in our society. We see plenty of on-screen storytelling in endless drenched in it, but there's nothing that compares with the face-to-face.
No, that's right.
Even if it's got to be 1.5 minutes.
It reminds me of when I used to give people guided meditations and then ask them what they experienced. And then people often say, well, I think my imagination went wild, you know, because I imagined this and that and the other. I said, where does imagination come from? It comes from within you. So whatever it is, has a message for you because it comes from within in yourself. So it's interesting the different how to find a borderline between imagination and reality, because a lot of things that we believe are real to us can be changed into a different perspective, and then what you believed was real earlier is just fictional. So I find that borderline changes.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah.
And nothing is truth, really. You know, that's what I've concluded. It's only a perspective.
Yeah. There's also something about what have we done with language, you know, so that what perhaps we meant by, oh, this is true, we might now sort of talk about, well, that resonates deeply for me, or that holds meaning for me, you know, because truth has come to carry baggage or something. Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, but there's something really, I think in our conversation we've had, we've touched on it sort of in various ways. The nature of story as both, you know, I really when I was talking earlier was really focusing on the healing nature of story. The flip side that we're remembering in our conversations is the potential for harm or for danger, the need to be careful with stories, the need to, you know, when we bring a story into a classroom that's from our faith tradition, to actually make space for people, for the listeners, to do what they will with it, rather than say this is the truth and you're all wrong if you don't believe it, or when we stand, you know, in a group of people and are asked to tell stories, to actually think deeply about who is in the audience and what stories are going to be helpful, appropriate, where is the potential harm in telling a story or in not telling a story. In telling a story that's not mine to tell, I haven't even talked about that, that if it's not of my tradition, I need permission from someone else if I'm going to tell it, or I need not to tell it at all. There's a care we need to take with our stories and with each other's stories as we hear them, because again, it's a vulnerable thing to tell a story. It might evoke something in someone they're not expecting. It might connect us deeply, and that's a bit frightening sometimes. Do you want to hear the story of the koala? No.
I was just going to say, before we do that, my father was in the war, in the Second World War with the Japanese, and he came home from that in another terrible state. And we, as an adult, he wouldn't talk really about his stories and that. And he said, well, someone's written a book of all the stories that we've been through, and you can read that, and it's called The Grim Glory. So we read some of it and think, oh my goodness. It was quite insightful about some of these stories and what had happened to some of these people.
It was a way for him to tell you some of his story without him putting himself at risk and telling a story he couldn't. Yeah, really important. Yeah. Blue koala. Long ago, you could go to a place called Gummaroo, and there you might, with a bit of luck, meet Koala Blue. She was easy to spot, with an unusual shot of spiked red hair right in the centre of her forehead. Or did you think her name was an indication of a general melancholy mood? That is true, I suppose. You could say that too. For she was always hiding herself away, so that she was sometimes actually not at all easy to find. She sought space to think and time to dream among the eucalypts of Gummaroo. In branches high or hollows low, she followed the clouds with her curious gaze, doodled in dirt, soaked up the sun, or closed her eyes to become a dolphin in the sea or a bird in flight. Koala Blue, where are you? Her friends would call when they wanted to play. Kangaroo and cockatoo, wombat and goanna would search for Blue and her red spiked hair, and she was grateful for their call, though to go calling herself was something Blue would hardly ever do. Kangaroo took Koala Blue far, far away, bounding over wide brown fields with his friend, a ball of quivering grey, clung to his golden shoulders. Then they would laze in dappled light beside a creek or a dam, turning for home reluctantly as sun made way for moon. Cockatoo sat with Koala Blue up among the leaves, munching and chuckling the whole day long as they concocted trysts and intrigues for unsuspecting residents down below in Gummeroo. Koala Blue and Wombat spent silent hours together, sheltered in the scrub of Gummeroo, happy to be close to one another and to be left alone, to ponder, think, or dream. Goanna had put a stop to nasty jokes about Blue's bright red hair in the schoolyard. Then she came up with a special name to celebrate that unique, unusual feature. Koala Blue is known as Ruthie to her mother. Koala Blue, where are you? Goanna came searching for a friend one day. But for once, that bright red hair was nowhere to be found, though Goanna did use her nose more than her eyes. Emu came as Goanna turned for home somewhat disappointed. Though Emu was no Blue, she would do, and Blue was soon forgotten. One day later, or maybe two, Wombat felt a sudden wave of amiability and wandered out in search of Blue. He nuzzled up beneath her favourite bushes and tilted his ear up to the branches, but Wombat could not sense the owner of that bright red shot of hair, not anywhere. And with amiability ebbing now, Wombat went on his way, alone. By now, it had been quite some time since anyone had seen Koala Blue or her bright red hair, so Cockatoo flew from and to the trees Blue liked to climb. Not here, not there, not anywhere could Cockatoo find Koala Blue, though all day she flew and long into the night, and even walked along the ground. Koala Blue, where are you? She called and called again. Kangaroo grew worried too when he saw Cocky fly hither and thither, up and down and round about for yet another day. Koala Blue, where are you? Roo's voice called further afield, to the water's edge, a dam they'd found, and further along the creek. But nowhere could he see that bright red hair, not anywhere. Oh, Koala Blue, where are you? As Roo slumped down beside the creek, he saw the surface ripple. What's there? Or who? Is that you, Koala Blue? Was that fur that I could see just below the reeds? Splash! Up jumped Platypus, that strange inhabitant of the creek. Oh, it's you, sighed Roo. I thought you might have been a red-headed koala, perhaps? Platypus finished the thought. Koala Blue. She often hides away, but never has she disappeared for quite so long or been so hard to find. I know where she is. And this time Roo jumped up. Wait, don't rush. It's a bit of a spot your koala's got herself into. She climbed down a hole, but slipped a bit, or a lot to be fair, and now seems not to want to climb back out of the dark. Kangaroo heard, and paused, and pondered. A gentle approach we might need, and I think I know who to ask. But first, will you show me please this hole that has swallowed our friend? Kangaroo followed Platypus and tried to pay attention. He had not been so far this way before. Round a bend, the creek became a river as the land fell away. There's a ledge down there, a kind of cave which I can see from under the water. Koala Blue is safe for now. She's made no move up and out, but neither has she jumped into the river. But if she wants to get out of there, tree roots might help her climb. I swim this way several times a day, call up to her in a cave. I think she hears, might even see, but she doesn't say a word. Can you stay here, near to her, while I go and search for help? I don't want to leave her alone. Of course. Though she doesn't speak, I quite enjoy having a visitor in my creek. Kangaroo leapt for Gummeroo as fast as he could go, and still, away out of town, he began to shout, "Wombat! Wombat!" Oh, cockatoo, I found Koala Blue. No time for details. We need the gentle wombat to coax her into the light. Without a word, off she flew, that cockatoo, to seek out gentle wombat, while Kangaroo lay down and caught his breath. Here I am. What's all the fuss? At the sound of his name, Wombat came shuffling out of the scrub. Wombat, Wombat, we need you now to help Koala Blue. Koala Blue? I've missed her too. Though I did not know she was in strife. Of course I will help. Show me the way. If she's in a hole, I know how to dig. Wombat went with Cockatoo, found Kangaroo, who showed them the way to go. They saw Goanna and shouted out to come along, but Goanna stayed. If she did hear, she did not understand. It took some time. They came and went, the three old friends and one new, over days and into weeks. They found they could not go into the hole with her. It was not safe, but they could wait and let Blue hear their voices as she began to move. Cockatoo could fly above and a little way towards her. Platypus popped his head above the surface down below her. Wombat dug a shallow hole and crouched beside the opening. Kangaroo would lie down too, but sometimes fear and waiting sent him bounding up and down the river. At last, she came, with growing joy towards the world again. Her friends all cheered her on and cried a little too, for they had seen the scrapes and courage of the climb. There was no party, no feast or fanfare, but instead a slow walk home together, once Blue was on the surface. They were all relieved and much delighted, Kangaroo and Cockatoo, Platypus and Wombat, to once more have her near and in the light, their dear beloved red-haired friend, their Koala Blue. Difficult story to tell, so I put it into rolling verse to make it easier to hear. Thank you everyone for listening and for a really engaging conversation. It's been a delight to be with you. It's just about time to finish.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's just been marvellous having you here tonight.
My pleasure.
And something different for us all
Good.
to listen to and to contemplate. I think we all go home now and write our own stories.
Ah, good.
So I think you've given us a boost to do that. I know I have to think of many stories in my life to think about. So you've given me the interest to start doing that.